Thanks. First, thanks for having me here. It's a wonderful opportunity to get to talk to folks. I was struck by your comment on baseball because I love baseball, and I think it's odd to point out something where people fail more than they succeed is the thing that we're going to kind of center around. Because, you know, a really, really good hitter, a great hitter, fails 70% of the time. So you got to kind of balance that a little bit. Love the memo, love the place-based initiatives. I don't know that it went far enough in terms of how we consider things almost at a global level, considering all the activities across the Pioneer, Vintage, and First Gulf region. Those are all places. Those are all places that are affected by inhabitants that have other, whether they're environmental or eco-social or other human geography-related activities that press and drive the change that comes along. It's interesting that we have the discussion because there's been such an explosion in technologies. And often people look at technologies as the way to move forward without understanding the underlying processes that are associated. Because every technology kind of assumes a process already exists. And so this is one where we follow the technology, but we need to understand the processes that go with that. I think that you're highlighting that a little bit in terms of how do we look at things. I can tell you within... this is no different within the Department of Defense and how folks look at decision support tools, etc. But I think the core piece of it, at least for me, from my understanding, is to be able to open content. And open content in a meaningful way that other people can access content and do what they need to do with it. So if we took an approach that was more of a global content exposure capability, what would that look like? I know that in recent meetings, you know, over the last couple of years as we've met with the Vice Chairman's staff and others, one of the issues has been a more direct exposure of content so that we can, A, increase understanding, B, have everybody off, you know, I hate to use a simple term, fight off the same map sheet, and B, to optimize the resources that we're spending. And by that I mean not necessarily spend less, but gain exponential increases in capability capacity based on the dollars that we're already expending on capabilities and technologies. So I think those are critical things to consider as you're looking at an overall cost of operations. Because any one group or set of individuals looking at the business aspect of this, I don't think would be able to afford to mount that kind of challenge. And I would look at the commercial industry as an example of that, although many of those groups like Google or Amazon or Bing are competitive. There are co-utilizations and activities that happen at transport layers, for example, that are pretty self-serving from a consumer perspective. So they leverage each other incredibly when it comes to that. And they use open standards and they use standards that they develop within themselves, but they usually are open and free enough that whether content is available within a certain aspect of the cloud or another part of the cloud, it's still the same content. We can both access it, manipulate it, use it for what we need to use it for. I think that's an important feature because I think whether you were at SEC or HUD or doing the kind of business I do, access to that content and being able to analyze it or utilize it is critically important. And I think that at some instances we do want the data to surprise us to a layer that we didn't expect to see something. For me, it's pretty core that we want to be able to have context and correlations when we look at activities that relate to places, but it's not just about the places, as you said, that it's about places and people, people to people, people to places, and places to people in other contexts, and how those threads follow along. I liked your example on justice. I think that's a good one to say, you know, one of the aspects I think that human geography is pretty territorial, right? I mean, it is pretty, you know, at some core tribal base, but does that just extend itself to other parts of the world or our own parts of the world too? I think if you started to use kind of, you know, look at the world in some of the major cities, you'd see people operate in neighborhoods and they operate in networks, and those networks operate in certain neighborhoods to other neighborhoods and other places. And when you start to relate activities and people and places to each other, whether that's for good or for bad, you start to see patterns. And I think that's one of the critical things I know we're looking at is so that we can start to anticipate problems before they arise, so that we have more of an expanded set of tools that we can provide decision makers, so that it's not always, we're not always defaulting to, let's say, a hard power solution. There are soft power, there are other options available to us if we can get far enough in front of problems and anticipate what's going to happen. I do believe that as you have more of a place-based approach to I'd say, the world, you understand better the influences, whether they're economic, environmental, and even support to catastrophes in a different light. How fast I can get to somewhere, who's really affected, where affected people are going to go to, where I need to target. Our agency spends a lot of time not just supporting warfighters, but first responders, lead federal agencies, and supported disasters here and abroad. National decision makers, policy makers, etc. So we don't look at those groups as particular product sets. We're trying to get to the point where we're offering our content and capabilities in that more broader, holistic approach, so that we really get to where we can get to letting people have access to content, doing things with content for themselves, and then us understanding what those relationships are as well, because it's the understanding of the relationships themselves, I think, that are going to give us some of the deeper context, the content. All of this has to happen in an agile, flexible environment. I will go back to my process. How we buy stuff. Not just that we buy into the cloud, but how we buy capability and capacity. How we define, as a government, a service or service agreements. How we look at critical things that are associated with, at least data from my perspective, is security of the network, security of the data, pedigree of the data. In other words, the quality of it. Is it really, really good data, or is it bad data? Is it intentionally bad data, or is it, those things kind of happen. Not that any of the people that work for me get up on any given day and say, how can I mess this up today? But sometimes mistakes in the network happen, and we've got to be able to identify those. I would much rather prefer to be doing some of the work that we're doing now with our content and looking at how we do these interfaces before WikiLeaks happened than after WikiLeaks happened, because it changes, the insider threat changes the paradigm on how you look at security. But I wouldn't just say security, internal, external. I'd also still say critical to the discussion is pedigree of the data itself, that we understand what we're looking at. Not that it all has to be perfect, but I understand in context what I look at. I understand the periodicity of, the time period which I'm looking at it, and if it's good enough to execute what I need to execute. We need to take a disciplined approach. I think often, at least the couple little discussions that I'm expecting more on the backside, usually when we look at approaches like this that get really big, little independent groups try to take an end-to-end approach to solve the entire problem. And I think this is a case where we might want to take a more disciplined approach to this. In other words, going back to the baseball analogy, maybe I want to have my second baseman play second base instead of trying to pitch. Maybe I want to make sure my hitters are actually hitters and that my pitchers are really pitchers, and everybody sticks to their position, whether it's glamorous or not, and that we get the business done. Because if we don't get, I'll use the word guts of some of the infrastructure right, in terms of open standards, how data is built and represented, how it's utilized within open frameworks, and they don't have to be open in a non-secure sense. We're going to have trouble referencing data to data, and I worry sometimes that we might actually get to the point where we get bad answers because of the way that the data is going to represent. So all of those things have to come together. I know within our agency we got, I applied some pressure. We got second baseman playing second baseman, and first baseman's playing first baseman. And we get issues now and then, but we're working really hard towards that, and I think we're doing a great job moving forward. In fact, I got some good news on a couple of things that we were working even today. So I do think this is a critically important effort. I know I was told by a couple of folks within the Pentagon that we really got to get to this point, if for no other reason, that we can't afford to have within the department anyway folks paying for these kinds of capabilities over and over again in multiple systems that are, whether they're decision tools or C2 support systems or even myriad of intelligence systems, that content and access to content within those domains and networks has to be consistent, and it needs to be conflated or aggregated to a proper extent.
Thank you, Keith. Just for your future reference, you still had 3 seconds left.
I used to build mission planning systems for Tomahawk.
I'm actually sure it was the agile method under the radar. Good morning, and thank you. I really appreciate being invited to speak here today. It's a great pleasure for me. I'm a geographer. I went to school to be a geographer. I learned geography at the University of California, Davis. It's a great place to study. And in that education, we came across one fundamental law in geography. Just one, which is, I think, kind of novel here. The closer things are, the more related they are. Right? That's the only thing that we get to talk about in geography. Of course, there's a boatload of corollaries there, right? The further away things are, perhaps the less related they are. And as we discuss these kinds of initiatives, we have to take into account that there's variation in space. So when we look at certain places, we realize there's certain qualities there because of the confluence of all kinds of things: human geography, physical geography, economic geography, political geography. All of these things have influence about how that place gets represented or how that place came to be. Likewise, as we make policy decisions about that place, we have to recognize those variations. Otherwise, we make global policy inferences and we end up with the wrong policy outcomes because of that variation in place. So the whole notion, the whole discussion is extraordinarily important. And I think we run the risk of being frantically wrong if we don't take into account those variations. So the conversation so far has been great. I think I'm going to sort of dive into a particular aspect, the aspect that I've worked on for the last year, the National Broadband Map, and sort of talk about how it's being translated and how the vision of that gets to further place-based policy. So I'd start off by saying, really, this is an initiative of the National Telecommunications Information Administration, not the FCC. The FCC is partnered with NTIA, but really the policy objectives, the policy goals are NTIA's. And NTIA came and partnered with the FCC to build the infrastructure. So they need the technical backbone to assemble all that information and make it digestible. They have this great approach to work with states and have states develop the data infrastructure, the actual collection of that information. Go figure. The people who own and operate sort of the functional background of implementation are regulatory agencies in states. They should know the best about their local geography. So why don't we have them map it and then send it into a primary single collection point at the federal government, and we can look at the entire thing. That seems like a novel approach. So have states map it, send it in. Let's move forward and create a single container. In our method, assembling all this information, quality controlling all this information, and producing the product, the National Broadband Map, broadbandmap.gov, we began our conversation with place. After all, it's a map. We had to start the understanding of how to build the technology, build the infrastructure, and build the database with the question of where. Where is this kind of thing? Where is this kind of broadband? And we did it at a very specific level. The address. A fundamental place where someone is going to be 100% of the time. Do I have service here? And from that place, we knew that we could aggregate to any other geography. So I could assemble all those addresses and go, how much of this quality is in, say, this city, or this congressional district, or this county? So fundamental law of geography, I can aggregate up. But we started the conversation with place. We didn't start it with identity or with some other quality. The second issue is context. We wanted to be able to see the difference in place. I tend to love Monday afternoons when I come home and The Economist shows up at my door. And the back page of The Economist is one of my favorite things to look at. It's the last page has this great indice of all kinds of economic metrics. GDP by country or change in GDP by country. And what's really fascinating by that is not the list, but where things are on the list. Minus third, minus eighth, minus 2 percentage points behind the first one, 8 percentage points ahead of the last one. It shows context of place. Without context of place, we don't know if we're doing really, really well or doing really, really poorly. So in the implementation of the National Broadband Map, we implemented this very robust analyze infrastructure that allowed me to see any context of any place. I could query any number of geographies, any number of broadband metrics, and find out where they ranked. Was my county 58th in deployment? Was my congressional district first in deployment? In fact, when we did the calculation, our programmers were really, really excited because they came back and gave me the metric of all of those combinations based on from census block up to the nation, and all of the different matrices of broadband statistics. We were able to employ 34 trillion different combinations of a query system on one web page. That's kind of cool. And our time budget for returning that information is about 2 seconds. So that's kind of neat. The third piece that we really looked at in the vision of developing the map technically, Keith spoke on really, really well, open standards. In fact, the broadband map itself as an application is nothing more than HTML, cascading style sheets, and JavaScript. The 3 fundamental components that the web was built on. If we start creating cylinders of excellence in applications, then you need a cylinder of excellence to consume it, as opposed to a single web page that anyone can consume. And anecdotally, it's worthwhile to mention, I was driving my son home from soccer practice last week. And true story, he looked up at me and said, "Daddy, what kind of code do I need to write to develop a web page?" He's 8. You know, I almost turned the car around and went right to Borders to give him a PHP book, but that seemed kind of inappropriate for the 8-year-old. But the fact is, if it's not in a page, in an open standard, we miss the boat. The standards we employed is an entire open stack. It's open API calls with all REST infrastructure, which means 100% of it is searchable, and developers can build off of it in very, very minimal lines of code. Barriers to progress. Again, I'll touch on a couple that have already been touched on, but I'll dive a little deeper into something Raphael said. This notion of those 3 people, excellent kind of cadre of things. I think in the developer, in the techie world, we tend to think of the Dublin core, the who, what, when, where, why. And when we develop systems, we start with who. And we spend, 50-60% of our time dealing with identity management, security of identity, and making sure that HIPAA compliance is in place with that social security number, and so that goes well. And then we spend part 2 of our time with the what. So that's maybe 70, another 30, 40%, 35% of our time. How do we manage that attribute structure, and what kind of technology and taxonomy do we have around those things? And then we have when. And we spend another 5% of our time thinking about when, and that's pretty easy because it's time management, but we have date issues and that kind of thing. So all of a sudden we're now at 95, 100% of our time, and we start thinking about where. How do I map where? That's an enormous mistake. We need to start with mapping where. We need to start our application development with going, this data asset is going to be used by multiple people, and the fundamental question they're going to ask is, where did that thing happen? So start our application development where. The second barrier, I think, is the industry I grew up in, GIS specialists, tended to think of us as different. I'm the common joke I remember is, well, I'm special, which Letterman could change one letter in there and say I'm special, right? I'm different than everyone else. I'm not. This is common data asset, and the common data asset includes where. The whole notion of the process that Keith mentioned, I think, is extraordinarily important. I think that from a federal point of view, sometimes the FAR restricts us to make sure we go down a waterfall method as opposed to an agile method. That's a different policy issue that we need to make sure we engage with. On developing further policies, I would say that no one should be prohibited from making maps. You show up at the council meeting on Tuesday night, the city council meeting, bring a map. Say, this is where I think the policy issue is going to change. We developed something in the FCC that we call Issue Map. It's an open website, issuemap.org, and you can go make a map based on a spreadsheet, and it becomes a persistent URL. That's a dynamic map based on common sets of geographies, like census districts and states and counties, and all you need is a spreadsheet. You don't need a piece of software, you don't need me. You just need a spreadsheet, and you upload it, and you get a map. So go make a lot of them. You know, show up at your meetings with lots of maps. The federal government can do a lot more. I think NTIA's directive, when it started the program, the Broadband Data Development Program, very specifically engaged state and local entities to create data. That was a huge step forward. It meant that there was a recognition that local entities might understand their place better than, say, just people inside the Beltway. For future policy issues with respect to how FCC operates, we have this new data asset, the National Broadband Map, that we'll use in truckloads of big policy decisions. I'll just tick off a few. Spectrum allocation. So the chairman has mentioned multiple times how we need 500 megahertz of new spectrum because there's, I don't know, 170 million smartphones. And there are a lot of people consuming lots of content on them. So we're going to need to manage spectrum, and spectrum is clearly an important place-based function. Where there are lots of people, there's lots of spectrum demand. E911, open standards around SIMS texting for location-based that I know OGC is working on is an important aspect that the FCC will be engaged with. Mergers and acquisitions, there's a big one going on right now between two large mobile companies. And for us to understand and approve that merger or evaluate it, we need to understand the footprints of those companies, how those companies operate, what kind of potential effect that has on consumers, and the broadband map helps us there. The Universal Service Reform Fund. This is approximately an $8 billion a year fund that goes to provide ubiquitous communication, mostly telephone, telephony, to the country. So if we're understanding how to invest that $8 billion regularly, it would probably be a really good idea for us to understand what the broadband availability is at specific locations and how that might influence future communication, whether it's IP phone only or connectivity through community anchor institutions or that kind of thing. I think key challenges to integrating means that I think Zav said it really, really well with his third point, embedding geospatial in new opportunities. We have to begin with geospatial. The question has to start with where, not who. Otherwise, I think we fail in the game.
Thank you, Michael. Jerry?
Thanks to NAPA for putting this together today. It's already been a very interesting discussion. I'm very pleased to be here to share some thoughts with you all about what we're doing at EPA with regards to place-based policy and kind of some of the issues and challenges in particular that I see coming up ahead. And a lot of this, as I listen to my colleagues here, you're going to hear many of the same messages, I think, in my talking points here. But in particular, one of the things that Raphael mentioned that really resonated with me was this notion of purposeful leadership and as a driver to implement change and true change in federal agencies. We've seen that recently, and I think it's in large part thanks to Zav and others at OMB and in the White House who have really started to promote these notions of place-based policy. So over the course of the past really several months, up to a year, our Deputy Administrator, Bob Perciasepe, the number 2 at EPA, has been in the process of directly leading, and he's very closely involved with this work to look across our programs to develop mechanisms for better coordinating our community-based activities at EPA. And that's really focusing on making place an important organizing principle for everything we do at the agency. Now, those of you who are familiar with the agency know we have a long-standing history, as I've mentioned, other types of place. There are watersheds and airsheds and ecosystems. We've managed our programs along those non-cultural kind of boundaries consistently in the past. But looking at the impacts of national regulatory decisions on local communities is something that we haven't done as much of at EPA, and we're really starting to focus on what does passing this rule mean to Battle Creek, Michigan, and starting to look at these very specific place-based issues in the context of all of our regulatory programs. And the real goals for this are twofold. One is outward-facing. We really need to better serve communities and help them in achieving our shared goals of protecting human health and the environment. EPA, like many federal agencies, has co-regulators. We have partners all over the country. We're not the only people who are involved in this. Some of this is about putting the tools and the information out there that communities can help us in achieving our shared mission outcomes. So I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing outside the agency. And then second, I mentioned the inward facing already. It's really to look as policymakers at the agency at the senior-most level, senior career and political levels at the agency, to incorporate place as a part of the decision process when we're considering new roles, when we're considering applying new policies. And how do we look to prioritize resources? I think it's not lost on everybody. Chris, others have talked about shrinking resources. How do we make the most of the resources that we have by targeting some of our expenditures and efforts in a geographic context? So with regards to our outward-facing activities currently, EPA obviously has a long history of using geospatial technology to communicate with our stakeholders and with the public, with communities. Our EnviroMapper series of websites were among the first federal websites that gave communities environmental information, specifically on regulating facilities, on permitting data, environmental monitoring, etc. They date back roughly 15 years. Likewise, our facilities registry system and its associated geographic data have really given the public access to, so what is that dry cleaner down the street? What permits do they have? How can I understand, whether this is a neighborhood that I might want to move into? What chemicals are around me? Etc. And over time, we've updated, those types of applications, and now we have an application called My Environment that really is sort of a central clearinghouse of much of this public information on the environment that we've adapted, I think most recently, to incorporate not just EPA's view on the world or our state co-regulators' view on the environmental conditions in the country, but really to encourage citizens to tell us what they're doing. We have this concept of a shout-out in My Environment that people can go in and say, we're organizing a watershed cleanup here, we're going out and doing this activity. So to start to try and engage the public in a conversation about what they're doing in their communities in an environmental context. So I think we've been, from my position, we've been extremely successful in our public face at using these technologies at the agency, and we have a lot of them. There are many, many, many good examples of public-facing web applications, in particular data distribution systems that really reach out to communities. And the effect of that is we've got communities coming to us and telling us they're confused. It's difficult to understand, which part of the agency do we go to get access to that piece of data. It's hard for me sometimes to understand when we regulate not just inside our statutory stovepipes at the agency, but across the federal agencies. It's difficult for me to explain. Well, actually, Mark and his colleagues at USGS carry this piece of the water data, and we have this other piece. It's not straightforward, and I think we as EPA, we as the federal government need to do a better job of organizing ourselves around these themes and trying to provide comprehensive, single source, points of reference where people can go and get the information that it is that they're looking for. And I think that's also reflected in the way that we execute our grant programs at the agency. We have many different grant programs that are really targeted for communities, but the grant giving process, the grant prioritization and issuance process in the federal government and at EPA is complicated. One of the things that we're doing in our current work on community-based programs is to try and streamline our grant opportunities for communities. We've gotten a lot of feedback that suggests if you're at a Big Ten or an ACC university, they have whole departments that are set up to manage the grant application process. They're going after these funds, and it's much more difficult for a small community to invest the time and the effort that it takes to go after one of our place-based and targeted grants, particularly if the opportunities are small. So streamlining and simplifying our public view, how we communicate environmental information to the public is a big focus of this work. Streamlining our grants and technical assistance programs to make sure that we're giving fair opportunities to communities to take advantage of the resources of EPA in helping us achieve our shared mission is also kind of the two major pieces of the outward focus of this activity. So those are kind of evolutionary things, and I think we probably would have been moving in those directions regardless of having some leadership in particular at the agency that was really pushing this. But where I expect to see the biggest change at the agency over the course of the next year or so is really in this inward focus, and kind of to echo a lot of the comments that other panelists have made. Grants are a good example of that. So how can we use geographic information to better prioritize resources of the agency? So it's one thing for people to be able to understand out there where they are in respect to EPA priority areas. How do I identify those priority areas? We don't at EPA have a great history of using geographic information as a way to target those opportunities, at least across all our programs. We might do it very well in one grant program or another grant program, but really to give the senior decision makers the ability to look across our grant programs, to look at opportunities for leveraging existing resources, existing funding opportunities in particular in communities. I think this became most apparent to me, at least, during the execution of the Recovery Act grants. Now, I want to caveat this by saying we have statutory limitations about how much, which programs we actually have authority to make those kinds of decisions. And in EPA's case, the vast majority of recovery dollars are actually formula grants to states who are required to make those decisions. But we do have discretionary authority on many of our grant programs at the agency. I would have loved to be able to tell the grant project officers, the program managers at EPA, that they can go to this website and look and see not just where EPA is looking, but where HUD is prioritizing their grants for DOT and others. We have a partnership with HUD and DOT where we've been trying to do some of those things in a sustainable community sense. But really to look across the spectrum of all the grant giving in the federal government, to look where we can better leverage each other's activities to more hopefully more effectively focus our increasingly limited resources. Another area that I think will start to apply place-based policy, place-based use of technology at the agency is clearly in our sustainability programs that are growing at the agency. One example of that is looking at the impacts of regulatory policy on the supply chain and the renewable fuel standards that EPA has released fairly recently. We have an obligation to understand how driving increased use of ethanol changes patterns of land use, not just nationally, but internationally. So what's happening in South and Central America because of a rule that we passed about changing requirements in ethanol, in gasoline in the United States. I think there will be many examples that come from our work in sustainability in particular that require us to look at life cycle and supply chain issues and really to use geographic data and geographic information as the way that we make decisions on what the policies are going to be that we implement from a sustainability standpoint. We're lucky that we have great private sector examples. In that case, Walmart and others have changed their business models around some of these concepts, and we're looking at partnerships with some of the, not just our federal partners, but also in the NGO and for-profit communities. So emergency response is always another area that we're looking to improve at EPA. It is a major mission area. This week we have response staff all over the Mississippi River area looking at protecting communities along the Mississippi, assuring that facilities that manufacture and store hazardous substances remain protected from the floodwaters and that human health isn't at risk. But we respond to hundreds of events every year, and they range from things like the Mississippi flooding, Deepwater Horizon, to a spill of a couple barrels of oil where the state in question just didn't have the resources to put somebody on the ground. We actually get a lot of calls like that where we come in where the state DEQs or DEPs don't have adequate staffing to respond to small incidents. And I think it's almost cliche at this point to talk about the importance of geospatial data and geospatial data sharing in the emergency response context. I think everybody recognizes that this is critical to coordinating response across agencies, executing, especially when there are multiple jurisdictions involved, state, local, federal, tribal, and others. And I think we've made really tremendous progress in this area, but clearly we still have some work to do, and this will become an important and continuing focus of EPA as we start to look at our place-based activities and coordinating the resources of the agency in a geographic context, and with our partners. So, by way of example, every day this week I've been on the phone talking with people from not just our response units, but from NOAA, from the Corps of Engineers, from FEMA, from many places. And I think we've gotten very good at knowing who to call at the other agencies and saying, what do you have? how can we get access to this? And I can look at, back over the course of the last year and our response, we've gotten much better. But I think we need to get beyond that and not know who to call, but know where to get their resources. We're still largely relying on people. Can you email me this? Can I get an account on your F2P site? And while we've gotten a little bit better at standing up our data, I think we can improve. And this really gets to where I think our greatest challenge remains. I think we all, see that we want to achieve a comprehensive data sharing, enterprise. The comments that were made, I think, by everybody earlier, hit something, home very hard for me, that I think we can't do that in any universal sense. There is no one GIS in the sky that's going to resolve every one of these problems that we're all up here describing. And I think we do need to be better and more diligent about working within our domains and working on specific problems, in data sharing. Emergency response, or maybe part of one of the emergency response functions of government, could be one example of where we have some good business cases. In emergency response, we get what we need in part, like I mentioned, because of those relationships. But I think we really need to look at this problem more broadly, across the federal government, outside of the emergency response example, and going back to the Recovery Act. We should have been able to immediately discover where other people were giving their grants or thinking about giving their grants, so we could look for opportunities to prioritize. So I think the need is broadly recognized, and thanks to Mark, the standard setting organization in our discipline, thanks to many people, with making the technology ubiquitous, really. I mean, geospatial technology is all around us. All the panelists have touched on this. I think we have those parts of the solution in place. But I think what we're missing is that we don't always have the data in accessible formats. So it was mentioned during the introduction, I work on the Data.gov project. One of the reasons that I've been engaged with that, and we're just starting to make some progress in this area, is I think it's great to have a catalog of data resources that are available, but I really want a catalog of immediately accessible data resources that are available. I want data that I can pull down to my computer without having to download it and do other things to it. I want data that I can immediately put on a map and combine with everybody else's data that I work with, and put that on a map and use it instantly to make decisions. I don't think we have great examples, NGA being probably the best, of agencies being able to do that and stand up those capabilities in their own organizations. We don't have that quite as well in a comprehensive sense on the civilian side, although the national map, my colleagues at USGS have done a lot in that regard. We have some pockets of it at EPA and at other agencies, but I think we have a long way to go in terms of making that comprehensive, so I know that I can get access to that data no matter what the issue is. And I think from a technology perspective, we have a real opportunity to make this easier for people. Zab and others, I think, mentioned the work at GSA, so there's infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. We need to leverage that and try and take advantage of it and make this a simple process that we don't bill agencies back for. I talk about this internally in my agency. Our office that does the best, I think the best job of making their data widely available is the Office of Water. They have tens or up to 50, I think, interoperable web services using Mark and his colleagues' standards that are available to the public. And their reward at EPA is a giant bill from my office, because they have to pay to make these things available to everybody else. And I think we need to think more clearly about how we fund these things, not just inside agencies, but across. Clearly the
Jerry,
I'm sorry.
We're beginning to run